Griselda Blanco was a Colombian drug lord and trafficker who was known as the cocaine godmother. She was responsible for smuggling over 150 tons of cocaine into the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. Blanco was also known for her ruthlessness and violence, and she was suspected of ordering the murders of hundreds of people. She was assassinated in Colombia in 2012. Maria Licciardi was the head of the Camorra, a powerful organized crime syndicate in Naples, Italy. She was known as La Signora, and she was one of the most feared women in the Italian underworld. Licciardi was involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and racketeering. She was arrested in 2001 and sentenced to 11 years in prison. Sandy Mazzola was the wife of Bonanno crime family boss Joseph Colombo. She was known as the godmother of Queens, and she was a powerful figure in the New York City underworld. Mazzola was involved in racketeering, money laundering, and loan sharking. She was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Judy Aiello was a member of the Chicago Outfit, an organized crime syndicate in Chicago. She was known as the Queen of the Outfit, and she was one of the most powerful women in the Chicago underworld. Aiello was involved in loan sharking, gambling, and prostitution. She was arrested in 1982 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Angie Boccia was a member of the Philadelphia crime family. She was known as the First Lady of the Mafia, and she was one of the most powerful women in the Philadelphia underworld. Boccia was involved in racketeering, money laundering, and loan sharking. She was arrested in 1982 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Phyllis McGuire was a member of the Bonanno crime family. She was known as the Black Widow, and she was one of the most feared women in the New York City underworld. McGuire was suspected of ordering the murders of several people, including her own son. She was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to life in prison. Rachel De Laurentiis was a member of the Genovese crime family. She was known as the godmother of Wall Street, and she was one of the most powerful women in the New York City underworld. De Laurentiis was involved in money laundering, fraud, and extortion. She was arrested in 2009 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Denise Zerpolo was a member of the Lucchese crime family. She was known as the Queen of New York, and she was one of the most powerful women in the New York City underworld. Zerpolo was involved in racketeering, money laundering, and drug trafficking. She was arrested in 1992 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Stephanie St. Clair was a Harlem racketeer who was known as Madame St. Clair. She was one of the most powerful women in Harlem in the 1930s and 1940s. St. Clair was involved in gambling, prostitution, and numbers running. She was arrested in 1943 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Rosetta Tharpe was a blues singer and guitarist who was also involved in organized crime. She was known as the godmother of rock and roll, and she was one of the most influential figures in the early history of rock and roll. Tharpe was also a member of the Detroit Mafia, and she was involved in gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. She was arrested in 1960 and sentenced to 2 years in prison.